Hi, my name is Dan Silverstein. I'm a strategic advisor. I have two questions. I'll ask both. I will indulge the panel if there's only time to answer one. Tony, you said that a budget is a moral document. My question to Dr. Marshall is, where's the moral outrage? Where's the Million Minister March in front of the White House with signs that say, stop screwing around? This is where our political will is going to drive the budget. The second question is, Governor Beasley talked about the number of people who died before the famine was announced and after. And I began to think about the Foods Network. Did the Foods Network, is it working? Did it fail? Where was it when these people were dying before there was an official declaration of a famine? Thanks.
As always, Dan, very intriguing questions. Any other questions, comments over here? Don't be shy. We have a hand. Dan.
Hi, Francis Smart, Michigan State. I'm just curious as to if someone could talk about the long-term impacts of famine on those who survive.
Thank you. There's a hand by.
Thank you. Aulo Jelly from IFPRI. I just had a question generally about accountability for famines. I mean, is there a way to hold people accountable? I don't think we actually talked about it, but these things don't happen at random, right? Is there a way in which our civil society, our governments can be held accountable for some of these?
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Lauren Kelly from the World Bank. I work in our evaluation group. I'll also maybe take the opportunity to ask two questions. One, the role of the international donor community. Is this not? No?
That's on. That's good. That's good. We can hear you.
In particular, the role of the World Bank in terms of the way that sometimes our projects can get stuck or not be available in time with regard to our own internal processes and project structures and procedures. Comments on that. And then secondly, experience from the past. When I think about these crises, I also think about, for example, Darfur. Is there thinking about translating lessons from former crises and the way that WFP worked in these crises and then taking them into the crises we're talking about today? Thank you.
Thank you so much. Right behind you, I think I see Channing.
Thanks. I'm Channing Arndt from IFPRI as well. One thing we can be fairly confident about in the budget is the U.S. military is going to have a fair amount of money. The U.S. military is heavily involved in these regions. What potential additional roles, or what are the roles for the U.S. military, for example, in this broad food security reign that maybe they're not doing now or they could do better?
Thank you, Channing. There are no final questions, comments. I've never seen an IFPRI audience be so limited, but there are a number of challenging questions.
Thank you. I just want to build on this gentleman's question. In Yemen in particular, what role could the United States play in restraining Saudi Arabia from creating conditions that contribute to that famine? Thank you.
Tell us your name.
Peg Willingham from IFPRI. Thank you.
Thank you. There's one last comment over here. Shari, are you going to do a lot of walking back and forth? So Gabe from FAO.
Gabe Liza from the FAO. I think this is more of a self-serving question for the UN. Governor Beasley, how can we do a better job selling our message on Capitol Hill? We do amazing work, but when they hear the UN, it's almost like they shut the door. Could you help us with that a little bit?
There has been a variety of hard questions that have been posed to the panel. I will suggest to the panel that you should be selective in responding to the questions that you wish to, and or build on these questions. And I'd like to suggest we go this way. Ambassador Hall, do not feel obligated to answer every single question, please.
Yeah. In regard to, I think one of the questions was relative to what should be done about the perpetuators of the people that cause famine. I think there was a question on that.
Yes, accountability.
And I think these are crimes against humanity. I think these people ought to be tried and sent to The Hague, to independent courts. I suggested when I was ambassador in Rome to the World Food Program, FAO, I suggested and not demanded, but I suggested that Mugabe, president of Zimbabwe, should be tried for crimes against humanity because he used food as a weapon against his own people. He bulldozed villages down. He committed all kinds of atrocities. It never went any place, but it got a lot of publicity. And but I think some of these people that, almost all of these famines are man-made, and I think they are major crimes against humanity, and they ought to be tried. I think they ought to be tried at The Hague, and I would be all for that. And so that's the question I was going to answer.
Well, while you're holding the mic, may I still come back on Channing's question for a moment, if you're comfortable?
What question
which
was
was that the role of the U.S. military. I mean, you've been successful in getting the $1 billion, but as we go forward,
Yes,
next 5 years, 10 years.
I've seen the military in action, and our U.S. military, and they do a good job on certain things. I remember them in Somalia in the early days when I was a congressman. They protected many of our humanitarian workers in Somalia when we had that major problem in Somalia. They did a great job. Our biggest problem in those days is we stayed too long. I've also seen the military supply hospitals with a lot of equipment, build schools, supply various villages, help them with certain agriculture projects. They don't do sustaining kinds of projects. They do quick fixes, and they do a lot of protection of civil society, and they are very good at that. And yes, they do fulfill a role, but they don't do long-term sustaining kind of work that I have seen. But they do some very good work.
Thank you so much. Dan, let's come to you next.
At the risk of making myself unpopular, the reason that we don't have good accountability for famines is because the people that you have to hold accountable are powerful people and powerful institutions, and they don't want to talk about it. Stephen Devereaux actually tried, who invented a kind of a famine accountability index 10 or 12 years ago, actually tried to assess from his own judgment, his own point of view, who was responsible for the Somalia famine in 2011. And on the list of that accountable actors is the U.S. government, because of the Patriot Act and the fact that OFAC restrictions, et cetera, delayed an appropriate response. On that list, with all due respect, sir, was the World Food Program, because they were absent and there was not a contingency plan for what would happen in southern Somalia if the World Food Program was not able to be there. And of course, there was also Al-Shabaab. There was the lack of courage on the part of certain humanitarian agencies to not go ahead and stick their necks out, et cetera. It's basically everybody in the room, and that's why it's so difficult to have a conversation about it. I also can't help but respond to the question about FuseNet. I have a good colleague in the room who wrote an article shortly after the famine was declared over in 2012, and the title of that article speaks for itself. The title of the article was "How Much Early Warning Does It Take?" And that article plots out very clearly all of the not only ordinary monthly updates that FuseNet and other early warning agencies do, but all the extraordinary alerts, bulletins, et cetera, that went out and basically were not responded to. This gets back a little bit to the point I was making about let's not be so fixated on the term famine or on the proportion of crises that kind of breach a degree of severity that we call them famines, and look at the totality of these things and look at the totality of what happens before and after a famine might be declared. And the case in South Sudan right now is definitely a case in point. But yes, FuseNet is working.
These are very interesting questions and hard to choose among them. The issue of the lasting effects of famine, I work a lot on the Sahel, and we see very clearly a lot of effects going back to the 70s. And some of them are quite unexpected. The challenges to the education system, including the Talibé, the street children issue, is very directly related to what happened during the famine years, the 7-year famine issues, the whole structure of the agricultural economy, expectations, even the psychology of the country. So these are something, they are world events that, as someone was saying, are world changing in the same way as, epidemics, famines are markers in world history, and you can see those effects in many, many different ways. On the moral outrage, I'm puzzled by it, but I think we're seeing a numbness. One of the issues on religion is that if you actually look at, SDG 2, zero hunger, it is one of the few issues where very few people have an argument against fighting hunger. So it is a unifying theme, and that is very attractive. And it's something anyone can imagine. That's one of the features of people who fast, is really to bring that awareness. But it seems that people are on some kind of moral overload. A lot of the churches are really trying. I see it on social media all over the place. At least every 20 posts, and whatever I'm getting is about the famine and the need to do something about it. But there hasn't really been anywhere near enough coverage. And on the question about the development institutions is one that really deserves a separate session and a separate panel. I mean, it really does come down to the issue of the failing states and what it is we're doing. There's one thing we all know, that traditional solutions don't work when you have lousy governance and when you have conflict. And we have at least some vestiges or some hints of ways to approach it in somewhere between 35 and 50 countries. But I think that we're a long way away as a community, and I'll come back on that in my final comment.
Thank you so much, Paul.
I'll just like to follow up a little bit on the FuseNet issue, and they're doing a good job, and they proclaim alerts and so forth. I think we have to remember that the data is coming from national institutions, and we need to make sure that those national institutions are supported. Those departments of agricultural marketing or the statistics agency that are collecting that data, going to the field, that's so important. And again, having the analytical capacity in those countries so that we're getting that information to FuseNet, but also directly to the policymakers in those countries. And then just in terms of the long-term effects and the long-term memories, in Bangladesh and in Ethiopia, you often heard, especially in Bangladesh, people remembered the history of the country, the big famine in the early 70s, and I think they've rightly take pride in the big progress that's been achieved since then. So this memory of a famine can actually spur some positive investments, developments. It hasn't always worked. There are plenty of countries where it hasn't worked that way, but at least in a few cases, it has.
I think, as to Tony's comments about the lack of moral outrage, a lot of it, and I've said this particularly in Europe in the last 2 months, Tony, doing a lot of TV shows, is I've been saying that one of the problems out there is the lack of awareness, because the media is so fixated or obsessed with Le Pen, Le Pen, Le Pen, or Brexit, 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 or Trump, Trump, Trump. And there's nothing wrong with those issues being deliberated by the media, but it's just an obsession, and there's not balance like we used to receive in the traditional media. And so a lot of people don't know about it. They don't know how bad it is, which is why we're going to these countries and trying to sensitize the people and the leaders around the world how bad it really is. FuseNet, there's no doubt it's improved, it's getting better. I was asking our team about this in terms of the data that we receive now on a daily, weekly basis, making the analysis so that we can pre-position and move in a much quicker fashion than before. UN perceptions on Capitol Hill, that is a serious issue, and I come from a part of the more conservative side, of which there are a lot of members of the United States Congress, Democrats and Republicans, as Tony and I would agree on, that think the UN has gone too far this way, it needs to come back to its roots. And so that's been shocking to several of my friends to see me take this role. And as I tell them, I'm not here to defend the UN system, but I can tell you as to the United Nations World Food Program, UNICEF, UNHCR, amazing operations that's getting it done. FAO, how we work together in cooperation. I mean, tremendous success stories. Stunting. As someone was talking, I can't remember who was, it said something about those who survive, the children that do survive. 1 out of 4 children in the world stunting. And you've seen the economic numbers. Jim Kim of the World Bank just put out some numbers about the 10 to 15% economic impact. It's astronomical. What's taking place in Yemen, an entire generation of children that are stunted. And I could go into Somalia, South Sudan, the list goes on, for those children that do survive. And you take those whose lives are at risk. If you took all the children under age 5, for example, as to the children we're talking about potentially dying in these 4 countries facing famine, all the children in Florida and all the children in North Carolina together, they'll be dead in 4 months. That's the reality. It's not some theoretical number in a country far away. These are real children with real lives who are going to die if we don't receive the funds we need to feed them. And the sad news is, if you end the conflicts, we've got the funds we need to feed them. But the needs for the World Food Program have been going up, 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 and up. U.S. military, only thing, I don't want to get into too much details of that here for obvious reasons, I would hope you'd think, but I can just tell you that we work with military operations of many different nations on any given daily basis for access, whether it's airspace in Yemen with the Saudis or the U.S., or whether it's in Syria dealing with the Syrian military, the U.S. military, Russian military, as well as others. We're dealing with that on a daily basis. We're looking at deconflicting zones right now in Syria. It gets pretty sensitive in some of these areas, so I can say that there are many militaries around the earth on the planet that can be very helpful in a lot of different ways. And so I'd like to see those discussions ongoing, but in the UN, we're neutral. And so.
Hold on to the mic, hold on to the mic. I would like to do the final 30-second key takeaway message you want to leave the audience with. All of you have given incredible wisdom, incredible nuggets, incredible passion that you've shared with everyone. And I would just like to say, if there was a tweet that you were going to send out or a 30-second message, this is the moment.
Well, I think it's simply we need to end the wars. And regardless of your religious, political views, please be thinking, praying, acting in any way possible to apply the pressure necessary, spiritually or non-spiritually, to all those engaged in these wars, and help us to bring this light to the American people and to folks around the world, because it is a catastrophe and it is an accident happening. So please, end the wars.
And over a longer period, I'd like to say that there's been a lot of progress made, and it's important that we stay the course. This is no time to cut back or stop the efforts. We need to keep going because there's still a lot of malnutrition, a lot of hunger, and continued famine.
We need a very, very broad set of partnerships to resolve the conflicts, whether it's track 1, track 2. Franklin Roosevelt, in a speech he never gave, said, "When in a crisis, pull any lever." And I think we need many levers. But at the same time, we have to keep the eye on development and on offering a better future for people. And if the humanitarian crowds out, the whole of the development agenda will never be successful. So somehow the focus needs to stay on the development agenda, as at the same time that we're pulling all the levers on the conflict resolution.
Well, I guess I would just reiterate that we need to look at the sum totality of these crises, not just at the bits that exceed the thresholds for famine, and we need to respond accordingly. If I may respond just briefly to the point about Yemen, we have seen over time that the subtitle of our book is about competing imperatives, and the competing imperatives are always a political imperative juxtaposed with the humanitarian imperative. And the humanitarian imperative almost always loses. So I think if we are looking at this from a humanitarian point of view, we've got to get better at working in these kinds of conditions.
Witnessing famine and seeing people die is a terrible thing to see. And of course, it's 1,000 times terrible for the victims. In those countries where there is terrible governance and mass corruption, there's not a lot we can do. But remember this, we have made tremendous progress. We really have. These resilience programs, these marketing programs, these programs have been set up by the government and the World Bank, and a lot of them, they are working. And can we do more? We can do a lot more. I guess the last thing I want to leave with you is that this budget that is coming up for 2018 is a moral budget. And as it stands today, all this stuff that we're talking about, it's all cut. It's eliminated. I mean, some of these programs that we're talking about, they're not just cut. They are zeroed out. And don't leave this advocacy, to your next door neighbor. If we don't work together on this, if there's a lot of publicity out there about a lot of other issues, but I'm telling you, we could wake up in December and see a lot of cuts, a lot of hurting people. And I'm very concerned about this. I am very concerned about this, that a lot of poor people could get really hurt in this country and in this world if we don't wake up to strong advocacy against the 2018 budget.